They didn't think anything of it. You know, it's just the way it was.
Yeah.
Yeah, he did whatever he had to make a living.
Yeah.
Some guy from the east wanted to collect orchids. Let's go get them. Yeah.
It was all here. In abundance.
Yeah. Yeah. You know, and those plumes, you know, being worth their weight in gold. And we just go into the rookeries and pick up the feathers that have fallen off. You know, we don't harm the birds.
That would have been fine, yeah.
That's what they said.
Well, we're here today, March 8, 2017, with Franklin Adams. And here is the Fakahatchee Strand Preserve State Park, right here at the Craig Britton and Art Ballard cabin. They now call it the Fakahatchee Hilton. And I appreciate your time today to kind of share with us some of the history that kind of got Fakahatchee started as a state preserve. And my first question is, right back at the beginning, I think you said it was either 1960 or 1961 when you and Mel Finn came to the Fakahatchee.
Yeah, 1961 was the year, and I didn't know Mel or know of him, but he talked to somebody, and they said, well, this guy spends a lot of time out in the Fakahatchee roaming around, and our family hunted here, you know, and we camped here, and so Mel called me, and we got connected, and I came out with him on a number of trips and shared places with him, and he always wanted to spend a night in the Fakahatchee. He had never done that, and so there was a camp. There were many camps in the Fakahatchee then, hunting camps and retreats, and the people didn't lock them. You know, some of them had a little sign that said, "You're welcome to use it, but leave it like you find it." So what we called Tram 10 then, there was a cabin on it and a little oak hammock there, and so it was a nice cool night, and so Mel and I hiked in and spent the night there, and that had a great time. Built a little campfire out in the yard, and that was a
62.
Yeah. It's been a while. I can't remember exactly.
The sequence
approximately.
Fades,
yeah.
A lot of barred owls, probably.
Oh yeah. The barred owls hooting, the swamp owls. Yeah, I love it.
So we know he got to spend at least one night out here.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, to my knowledge, that was the only night I ever spent out here. And Mel he didn't approve of hunting, even though my family were hunters. And I remember that night, there was a box of 30 shells on the shelf. And he said, I'm going to take those and get rid of them. I said, Mel, you're not going to do that. I said, these people are kind enough to let us stay in their place, and you know, they have a right to be there.
Sure.
Oh, okay. You can edit that out.
Was the hunting mainly deer and hog?
Not hogs, except down the prairie occasionally, but mainly deer. Yeah, and some turkeys. Yeah, but turkeys were mainly on the periphery.
And Mel kind of just caught that Faka habit, as we refer to it today, or caught on fire for the place fairly quickly.
Yeah, he was very, very passionate, and had been a member of the Orchid Society in Dade County, but then he discovered the native or wild orchids in their natural habitat, and he became obsessive about it. And we realized there were possible threats to this area, and growing mainly on the west side from Naples, and Mel got this idea that we wanted to preserve or protect this area. It was a long battle, and it honestly, I can say unequivocally, a lot of people came and helped later on, like Nat Reed. But if it hadn't been for Nat, I don't think it would have happened. It would have been some kind of fragmented remnant. He made all the difference. He was just obsessed with it.
Okay, Mel really made it all. He was the one that condensed everything.
Right. He was living proof that one person can make a real difference on an issue or a situation.
A lot of passion.
And he did, yeah. And he was originally from Atlanta, Georgia, and he served in World War II, and then he through the GI Bill, he went to the University of Miami, got a law degree. It was provide a living, but he didn't like practicing law once he discovered this. You know, he just wanted to be out here all the time, and actually wanted to be closer. So he was trying to buy a house in Everglades City, and which my brother lives in today. Mel didn't buy the house, but I had the original listing, and we wanted $14,000 for it. But he and his wife Margaret, they became good friends, and we spent time with them. And Mel would call. We did most of our work by telephone then. Neither one of us typed, and didn't have computers and all that. So most of the conservationists and people in that time mainly conducted, their work by telephone. And when I worked with Marjory Stoneman Douglas for years, she was not a morning person, so we would have a conversation starting at 9 o'clock at night and talk about issues and what to do. And so not as much documentation and written detail today with some of the issues that were fought.
Yeah. You said that Mel Finn started this chapter of the Nature Conservancy?
The Florida chapter of the Nature Conservancy, yeah. And that was in 1961. And then in 62, because of Mel, they formed the Fakahatchee Committee, Swamp Committee, and got a number of people, anybody that was interested in the Fakahatchee, orchid people and people from Dade County, people from Collier County, and Mel got a lot of help from people like Jane Parks, the Florida Women's Garden Club, I think it was, and so people knew that it was threatened. The Gulf American Land Corporation was out there, and of course they eventually ended up buying it, much to Mel's. He was very depressed about that, and you could buy it then for $10 an acre in a section, but they bought it on paper from the Lee Tidewater Cypress Company for $100 an acre. That's why they got it. And it was a fight that went on for many, many years and many, many disappointments.
Sure. Wow.
We got enough swampland, we don't take off the tax rolls.
Right.
What good is it?
Right. Well, that leads me to the question of the picture behind us here, because once you guys, I know Mel kept wanting to get as many people out into the Fakahatchee as he could to gain more support, especially for those who could kind of help purchase Fakahatchee for conservation purposes. And finally on that day, 1971, did you say?
May 1st of 1970, yeah. Yeah.
So that's kind of the modern era, I guess, of the conservation of the Fakahatchee, which started at least initiating land acquisition a few years later. Because he needed to convert people, otherwise it was, cut over swampland.
Yeah, second growth. Joel that was his attitude, and but Mel stressed that it was growing back, it was recovering quickly, and that the botanical wonders were still there, and he documented a lot of that. And Claude Kirk was the first Republican governor 100 years, and he connected with Nat Reed and brought Nat to Tallahassee a lot of the time, and Nat was head of the new Department of Pollution Control statewide committee, and he hired a fellow named George Gardner, who's in the photograph there.
He's the second one from the left.
Right.
You're the one on the left.
Yeah, I'm the one on the left. And then that's George Gardner in the dark shirt. And then the tall guy is Nathaniel Reed. And then the next guy is Nay Landrum, who was from DNR, was head of the Florida Park Service. And then, of course, Joel Cooperberg on the right-hand side there. Clyde Butcher took that picture on May 1st, 1970 in the afternoon. No, not 1970, I'm sorry. When we had the dedication, when that was taken, 1999, we came out. And on April 30th, we, finally got Nat and all of them lined up. Nat was reluctant to come down here. He was a busy guy, and his new position was very controversial. And he had a lot of bases to cover, but finally convinced him to come down here that was worth the trip. And so the governor provided him a twin-engine plane and flew him and Nay and George Gardner down from Tallahassee, and they landed in Everglades City. And then they had 2 highway patrolmen show up with the cars to chauffeur them and keep an eye on them. And so the night of April 30th, my mother was very ill with cancer, but I went to see her that afternoon and talked to her, and she said, "No, please go. Y'all been playing this. It's important." You know, so I came over, Mel and I, and he and I stayed at the old Illinois Motel, which is still in Everglades City. It's called the Everglades City Motel today. It was a lot cheaper than the Rod and Gun Club where Nat and all the rest of them stayed. But we went down there that night and had a nice meal, and they had some wine, and Mel and I did a dog and pony show for them with slides that we'd taken out on the Fakahatchee, and to show them where they were going to go the next morning. And it was funny because Nat was so enthusiastic about this place that he was saying that the royal palm trees in here are 100, 120 feet tall. And Joel Cooperberg, who was, you know, director of the Caribbean Gardens, and it had some botany background. He disputed Mel on the height of the trees, but Mel told him no, he was incorrect. It was kind of funny that they were
very tall.
Yeah. But anyway, well, I won't go into detail, but about midnight that night, we didn't have a phone in the room, but the office came over and woke us up, and I found out my mother had passed away, so I had to turn around and go back to Miami at daylight. And so I didn't come into the swamp with them on May 1st. But also a person that's not in the photograph here was Ken Alvarez. I talked to Ken yesterday afternoon. I finally tracked him down up in Osprey. He was a young biologist he'd just been hired that week by DNR, Department of Natural Resources. So this was his first visit to Fakahatchee too. So he went in on the walk with the group, and he had a machete, and Nat kept telling him, "Be careful with that thing." Well, anyway, long story short, George whacked himself with a machete, and they had quite a time getting him out of the swamp that day. But that visit captivated and captured Nat Reed's attention and support, and he knew what Mel was talking about was the absolute truth. This was a jewel. It was a lot different than across the road in Big Cypress. It was the major swamp strand. It was worth preserving, but at that time there were lists of conservation lands in Florida. Many of them were much higher priority than this place. It's just cut over swampland. Don't take it off the tax rolls. Yeah, we got enough swamp. And we were up against, with the politicians that we wanted to have support from to preserve it, protect it somehow, we were up against Dade County with Dante Fussell, because that's where his votes were. And being a good politician, he was thinking, I'm going to support Biscayne over Fakahatchee. Rogers Morton, I think, he got pretty interested. Mel got a hold of him, and see Rogers Morton in the interior, I believe it was, and he did get some people interested in this area, and of course Mel and I were always available to bring anybody out that might become involved and help us. But it was one loss after another, and I remember Mel and I drove downtown, and we went to lunch with Congressman Fussell, and who's John Pennekamp State Park. I think there's a facility there named after Dante, because he was involved in that acquisition, that protection. We had lunch with Dante, and Mel did most of the talking. I'm just standing there, sitting there watching body language and facial expressions, and I could tell that Dante was a very nice man, but Biscayne was being pushed, and I could tell that he was a little evasive, or that he wasn't going to push the Fakahatchee for Mel, but then after he left and Mel and I went out on Flagler Street there, Mel was real excited. Oh, he's I didn't throw water on Mel, but I could see that from watching Dante and just listening that he was a good politician, but Fakahatchee wasn't where the votes were or the support at that time.
Close enough to home for him.
Yeah.
Right. Well, it really does sound like Mel caught on fire for the place, caught that original Faka habit, and just kept pushing. He just wouldn't become pessimistic about it. He knew that the values of these resources, the orchid capital, the bromeliad capital, almost the fern capital, the royal palm capital of the United States. There's a lot of superlatives. The largest single strand swamp in the entire Everglades ecosystem. And then complement that with all the megafauna, the bear, the panther, and the Everglades mink, and river otter, and bobcat, and all that. He knew it was an easy place to sell if you could get people out.
Yeah, and that's still true today. Get them out there and you may capture them. But I have copies. Mel wrote anybody and everybody, trying to get people interested in the Fakahatchee, and somehow he didn't care whether the state of Florida got it, owned it, or the federal government made a national monument out of it, or a national forest, or whatever. He just wanted some kind of protection, so he went after everybody and wouldn't give up. Just kept gnawing away. And it took a while to get Nat down here and get his attention. He had a new job and lots of responsibility and for dealing with pollution, which was new at that time in Florida, so to speak. But it was because of his persistence and not giving up.
Well, it's really fortunate for all of us, including the Fakahatchee, that you were able to get Mel out here. So I always thank you every chance I get for taking him out there. Because of that, I have my job.
Well, I was passionate about the place too, and spent time here, like I say, with my family. It was a wildlife management area. Back in the 50s. Now, they didn't do any management, but the game warden would drive through every once in a while. But and then we just camped and roamed and explored. And so when Mel asked me, that it was just like being here today. It was great to be out with someone else that loved and appreciated the area and was concerned about it.
Well, you guys both had the passion, that's for sure. We always appreciate your time. Yeah. Was there anything else that we didn't cover in the picture? I think you covered all I know about.
Well, George Gardner, I don't know if I mentioned it, but he was Nathaniel Reed's assistant in Tallahassee. And like I said, Nat was head of the Department of Pollution Control and a new agency. And George was a graduate of the University of Florida with a degree in forestry and wildlife. And so he had some knowledge, schooling to help Nat. Mm-hmm. And then, of course, Nathaniel Reed's from Hobe Sound, Florida. He had the good fortune to come from a wealthy family, and that they developed a lot on Jupiter Island. And I told Nat one time years ago, though, that I wish we could clone him, because he had the resources and the drive and the passion, and a great speaker. Yeah. And to do what he did so much for Florida. And then when later on, he was, of course, Governor Kirk's environmental advisor, and later on was an advisor to Nixon in Washington, and he had a big role to play in the Fakahatchee being saved or protected, because he got the governor's support for it, and he's done so many wonderful things and served on so many boards and committees and over the years, and just an inspiration. And wow. He's Nat's in his 80s now, and he hadn't slowed down much, but and then next to Nathaniel is Nay Landrum. A real gentleman. Nay was head of the Florida Park Service, the Department of Natural Resources, and was their director, and came down, and he was really captivated by the Fakahatchee. And of course, he had a lot of competition for acquiring property, and you know, had to pick and choose and sort and everything. But that trip made all the difference. Okay. And then the gentleman on the far right there, Joel's not around anymore, Joel Cooperberg, and he was the director of the Caribbean Gardens in Naples. He was involved early on in conservation efforts in Collier County, and then later on he went to Tallahassee and worked for some of the state agencies and on land acquisition and different issues, and was a real spark plug himself.
Yeah. He had told me in 1999, he said, I have to admit, Mike, I wasn't a big fan of Fakahatchee. Mel called me multiple times, and finally I gave in with one condition. He said, Mel, if I don't become converted into your way of thinking about Fakahatchee after this visit in 1970, don't ever ask me about Fakahatchee again. That was the deal they broke.
That sounds like
And then he admitted to me, Joel did, he says, I have to admit, Mike, after one day in the Fakahatchee with Mel Finn and everybody, I was completely convinced.
Yeah, because that night, the Rod and Gun Club, Joel was being tactful, but he was kind of throwing water on this cutover swamp, you know. Yeah. And but go see it yourself, and maybe if you haven't seen it, then don't form an opinion. You know, always good policy.
Mm. Well, it's amazing you brought up all the accomplishments of Nat Reed and of course Mel Finn and you. You guys paved the way for us to come and enjoy what we get to enjoy as career or even just as recreational opportunities. So I thank you for all you've done. I know it's not fun doing what you guys do. The fun stuff is out here. It's what you guys save.
Yeah. Well, I came to the realization when I was in high school, which is worse, picking up the morning Miami Herald and seeing what those SOBs are going to do next week to this beautiful area, or get involved. You're still going to be miserable sometimes, but hey, once in a while we win one, and that's a good feeling. You know it's worthwhile. And this is living proof, you know, that people finally came around, and it's been preserved and protected. And now the biggest unit in the state park system,
right,
with a whole 5 employees.
Well, we're all proud of the place. You know, well, that's why we come here. We do the best we can. We are. We are. We do love the place. Yeah. And Marjory Stoneman Douglas, another pioneer. Yeah. And, you know, because of her.
Well, she was involved indirectly because I was a Collier County chairman for Friends of the Everglades, and so we talked back and forth all the time. And she wrote letters and lobbied too, and in that grand way that she had, and a couple times I saw Nat and her kind of get in a little conflict, you know, and Marjory never shirked for opinions, and they were usually very intelligent, well-founded, valid opinions. But yeah, she was an incredible person. Lived to be 108 years, you know, and she would come to our house in Naples and stay with us 3 or 4 days, and in the evening, Kathy and I'd be preparing the evening meal, and I would fix Marjorie her scotch and soda. She couldn't drink wine, didn't agree with her, but she would go and sit with our children, and that was their time. We didn't interrupt, and talk to them and to spend time with them. And then, like I said, she wasn't a morning person, but I could get her up around 10 sometimes. So I'd go into work, and then I'd come back, and she learned her way around the house, even though her eyesight was failing, and she knew how to make her tea and stuff. But I would take her to the Friends of the Library, or the Isaac Walton League, or the Naples Historical Society, or Collier County Audubon to give a talk about, you know, and I remember one time the Friends of the Library, they're expecting to hear about, she's a writer, an author. She wrote this wonderful book in 1947, The Everglades River Grass. Well, they would hear about book writing for maybe 5 minutes. Then they were going to hear about, you need to get out there and save the Everglades and the Big Cypress. You know, she always was on message. And she did that to the historical side, any group, you know. And somewhere I have a couple recordings of the Audubon had their first statewide conference, I think, at the old Remuda Ranch, Port of the Islands. Yes. And she and Art Marshall got up and talked. And it was incredible. And somebody asked her why she became an environmentalist, and she said, well, actually I'm a conservationist, but I know there's environmentalists emerging, and but why did you do this? And she said, well, it was just, I wrote that book and then met a lot of people because of it, like Gerald Parker, and became interested in people, got me involved in conservation or preserving the land. And she said, the reason I've been at it so long, she says, I got bitten, and I've stayed bitten. I'm the hardest bitten of the whole bunch. And so I keep doing this, you know. But I remember when they declared the panther an endangered species. Of course, she was delighted about that. She was fascinated with big cats. But then Dave Mayer and those guys in the 80s, with the old Game and Fish Commission, they brought in Roy McBride with his hounds, and they started chasing these panthers up trees and putting choke collars on them and stuff. She hated that, and it chewed on me a lot about, you got to get that stopped. Well, I said, Ms. Douglas, I said, we don't know anything about those panthers, really, and there's so few of them. I said, I've talked to the biologists. We need to do this for a while. And we did find out things we didn't know. I was on the Big Cypress Swamp Committee then. We dealt with oil issues, representing the conservation groups. Wetlands were sacrosanct then. Don't go and disturb the wetlands. We were go to Bear Island, siting oil wells in the middle of climax hardwood hammocks because it was upland. It took 4,000 or 5,000 years to get to where they were. Then we found out from radio collaring panthers, that's where they like to hang out. That's where they like to den and have their young, you know. So I finally convinced her that there was some benefit to studying the panthers.
We do need information, habitat usage.
Yeah.
That kind of thing. Well, you've lived a fortunate life too. You were around at a time when really the environmental or conservation movement really got going. Rachel Carson, 1962, kind of galvanized that whole thing too. Cuyahoga River catching on fire in 68 or 69. Then the Clean Water Act, and just so much happening in the 60s and 70s. So.
Yeah, it was an interesting, fortunate time. And I'm kind of bothered today. There's a lot of divisiveness among the environmental groups, a lot of competition for money and funding, and disagreement. And back then, you might not like me because I'm a hunter, but I'm a conservationist. I love that place out there. We're going to forget about our disagreements, and we're going to work together because there's so few of us, and there's power in working together. And that was very true then, and we overlooked differences. You know, Marjory Stoneman Douglas used to say about Johnny Jones, the plumber from Hialeah, Florida, that saw his Florida going to hell and became the director of the Florida Wildlife Federation with his wife Mariana. And because of Johnny, much of the legislation and good things we have in Florida because of that old cracker, you know. But Marjory used to meet with Johnny, and he always, you got to hunt it. Yeah, let's save it, but we got to hunt it, even if it was 10 acres. And Marjory used to say, you know, Franklin, sometimes I could put my arm around him and just hug him. Other times I put my arm around his neck, strangle him. Yeah, they did disagree, but they overlooked that at the end of the day. You know?
The overall agreement was conservation in general. You guys were able to get the Big Cypress as a national preserve. I believe the first national preserve.
It was.
In the National Park Service.
Yeah.
And that was everybody coming together because the odds were stacked against that.
Yeah, the catalyst for that, as you know, was the jet port, world-class jet port. And it formed, Marjory Stoneman Douglas' little group, the Friends of the Everglades, was formed because of the jet port. The Isaac Walton League chapter, one was formed in Naples to fight the jet port. And it galvanized a lot of people. Okay. And we really never thought we'd stop that thing. The skids had been already greased. And I remember Charles Garrett, who was head of the Isaac Walton League, I took over from him later on. We got an appointment with Dick Judy, the head of the Miami Port Authority, that was pushing this, and went over there to talk some sense into him. Well, they didn't throw us out, but we were not made to feel welcome. You know, that's how naive we were. Well, we ended up, you know, Nat got involved in that, and Nixon got involved in it, and he did some good things in Florida for whatever reason, and we ended up stopping the jet port. It was incredible. Yeah. And there were signs all along Alligator Alley then. It was just 2-lane, and the Tamiami Trail, big signs, real estate signs saying buy land, get rich, $10 down, $10 a month. So the pressures were building all around here. Golden Gate Estates. And they, excuse me, so we knew after the jet port was killed that we had to keep pushing on the Big Cypress. And we didn't get any help from anybody except a few of us in Collier County. Florida came up with this, something called Chapter 380, and it was looking at areas in Florida and declaring an area of critical state concern. Oh. And Lorenzo Walker was our state representative in Naples, an old family of Walkers. And we wanted to declare the whole Big Cypress watershed, not just what became observed, but the whole watershed, an area of critical state concern. And we thought we had the facts to do it. And that's another story in itself. Yeah. But we got John Van Arsdale, who owned Naples Airlines. He donated one of the old twin-engine planes he had, and we got an appointment in front of Mr. Walker's committee, and the guy, I can't remember his name, he was an SOB, in Tallahassee. And we took off from Naples Airport. It took us 3 months to get this appointment. We're about over Tampa, and we get a radio message that the chairman has canceled the committee meeting in Tallahassee. So we had to turn around and come back. Wow. So, after we stopped the jet port, we knew the threats were still there to subdivide and sell off property in the Fakahatchee and the surrounding area to people all over the world. And so the Florida had come up with a legislature with something called Chapter 380 under the Land Use Code. And you could declare an area in Florida an area of critical state concern that would bring in more funding and focus people on the need to plan for growth in it and protect sensitive areas. And so it was quite a fight to get that done. But after that canceled flight on the way to Tallahassee, an insurance guy here, and was a friend and was in the Isaac Walton League with me, Harry Cunningham, he had a friend who had a little single-engine plane. And his friend said he would fly us to Tallahassee if we'd pay for the fuel. So that's what, we got an appointment, and we flew. I remember when we went by MacDill Air Force Base that we were doing VFR, you know, and said, watch out for jets, you know, see any military plane. Anyway, we made it to Tallahassee, and we went before the committee, and all the committee members were polite except one, and they thanked us for coming, and our state representative wanted to cut out OK Slough in what they call the boot, going south of Immokalee, exclude that though, because there was some big ag interests there. And but long story short, that was not taken out, and eventually this was declared the first area of critical state concern. That facilitated it becoming acquired, you know, the Big Cypress.
That was the first phase.
Yeah, yeah. And the Park Service, of course, didn't want the Big Cypress. It wasn't going to be a park. Oh. And, you know, they administered parks. Mm-hmm. So for the history of Big Cypress, a lot of them have tried to run it as if it's a park instead of a unit of the Park Service, which is a preserve, the very first one. So there's been a lot of management problems, a lot of litigation, it's still ongoing, you know. But eventually, the state of Florida could have had it, but they didn't want it either. But it was, Park Service was told, you're going to take it and administer. It's a big piece of ground. And so anyway, in '74, we got the, you know, the Big Cypress. But in just my lifetime, things have changed a lot here. Some are better, but most are worse, in my opinion. And when we used to come here as a kid and come into Fakahatchee out in the Big Cypress, we never took water with us. that's how clean the water was then. We just go down in a head, and where most of the time we were out here in the winter through spring months, get behind a big cypress tree where it was shady and wasn't a whole lot of detritus, and we'd just scoop up water, and then we'd take it back and put it on the campfire and boil it, and we never brought water. Now I wouldn't think of doing that, anymore. There's all kinds of stuff in the water. The water quality, as we know in Big Cypress, though, is much, much better than it is in the river grass and the true Everglades and the lake and all that. We're fortunate in that way, and maybe a lot of it has to do with all this great swamp vegetation, helping to clean the air and water up. But there are changes in the water. When we would canoe, our favorite place was the Turner River, and we would canoe and camp down there. There were areas on the Turner River where there'd been calusa, like seasonal little settlements and hunting or fishing locations they stayed on for a while. And opposite those in the river was a clean shell bottom, and we used to swim there. And you'd reach down and pick up that big clamshell off the bottom, and when you did that, all kinds of little critters would go scurrying off. It was a nursery. Today, that same area in Turner River, you don't know it's there. It's under a foot and a half of detritus. It's not as productive as it once was. That's a big change. And a lot of the creeks, of course, are grown shut with the red mangroves, and there are even Brazilian pepper shyness down in the most remote areas now. I guess we can blame that on the robins, maybe. But so there has been a lot of change, and botanically, the hunters, the crackers, gladesmen, whatever, they used to burn about every 2 years. It was beneficial by and large. We had lots of bluebirds, cottontail rabbits, bobwhite quail. There was a lot of them in the cypress. Red cockaded woodpeckers.
Probably turkey too.
Yeah, because of that burning. And when the National Park Service took the preserve over, they had what I call Smokey the Bear syndrome. They didn't know that fire was just about as important down here as water on the ground, and so it took a lot of years to convince them. And so during that time of lack of burning, we lost a lot of that wildlife. There's been a big change there. Not seeing as many orchids as we used to, and it's not all collecting. Almost any cypress head you went in, we'd walk in there in the spring dry season this time of year because it wasn't deep and all that. You'd see lots of lots of orchids, native orchids.
Especially
it was quite common.
orchids. They were abundant, right?
Very abundant. Yeah, on everything. And why there's less orchids, I don't know, but some of it has to do with fire, drainage. Like the Turner River, it's not getting that hydro period or that sheet flow anymore. They built that road north and cut the swamp off from the river, and so it's just silted up. In the bays and estuaries, when you get down the coast the same way, the grass beds that used to be there are not there anymore. And it's all because of lack of fresh water flow, enough water at the right time of year. I don't have to tell you, but but I have seen a lot of change, and of course there are a lot more people everywhere you go than there once were. And my first time that I came to Big Cypress was my birthday present when I was 7 years old, with my daddy and his friends and my uncles, and they were going to go deer hunting. And they had a campsite they used inside the loop, and off the trail, south of the trail. And I remember somebody got off work late Friday night, and we had to walk in the dark, and it was in an oak island, an oak hammock, and they built a campfire. They had firewood stacked up already. And I remember just sitting there leaning against an oak tree, and they cooked supper on the fire, and listening to my dad and them telling their old, tales and oral stories. And it was a front was coming in. Been a warm day, and it was cooling down. The front was coming, and so there was like ground fog or mist mixed with the smoke from the campfire. And I remember as a kid just getting drowsy and seeing things that had smoke. I saw boats, I saw deer, I saw all kinds of critters, you know, until I fell asleep. And 2 days later, I found out that sitting on the ground under an oak tree when it's dry, there's these things called red bugs or chiggers, and so I had a big visit from them. Okay. But lesson learned. But that was my first time, and I think it captured me because I came back every chance I got. And
7 years old.
Yeah, I built my first swamp buggy when I was in high school in my parents' backyard, so I could go without my parents, you know, without my daddy. And, but today there are a lot more people concerned about these areas than once were, and people are more educated, and we realize how important swamps are, you know, even when they've been logged in its second growth.
These places are treasures, not just for the wildlife, but for recreational opportunities for us. It's really a win-win.
This natural greenhouse, you know, it's just incredible. Just incredible. And
how about the wildlife? Were the deer more plentiful, I guess? Or
no,
not really.
No, there was an awful lot. There was people that poached them and sold the venison. There were people. It was standard practice with these old guys, and they'd go into camp. they'd shoot a deer on the way into camp. It might not even be hunting season for camp meat. And there was lots of poaching both by the local people and the Indians back then. The Indians had the right, and some of them did, you know, hunt the deer and sell the meat and venison. There was a market for it. So there was less deer. There were lots of hogs back then, though. Lots of hogs. They really had spread. People hunted them downhill with dogs. I mean, that's how common they were. And you could tell when the hogs had been in there, of course, because all the rooting, you know, little rototillers went through there. Squirrels were quite plentiful then, both fox and gray squirrels, you know, in the 50s. And today we see more fox squirrels because of the burning in Big Cypress than we do gray squirrels anymore for some reason. I don't know. Just a local observation. But
how about cottonmouths? Were they very common?
When I was in high school, the way I made my spending money, I was just what they called a snake hunter. And I caught snakes and sold them. My dad forbid me to capture or sell an indigo snake. He had been in charge of the cotton gang in the Florida Keys when the agriculture people thought that, you know, the wild cotton was a host for the boll weevil. And so they cut a path every 53 feet in the Keys from the bay side to the ocean side, and they killed every snake they saw. And so he had a great respect for indigos, and if he was there, he prevented them killing it. But otherwise, they killed every snake they saw. And but I sold snakes to Ross Allen. In fact, I met his son at a talk I gave a couple months ago. It was really neat. He came up. And Bill Haas.
Bill Haas.
Yeah, and Bill would only buy the venomous snakes, cottonmouths and rattlers, because he would milk them for the antivenom, and then he, of course, was an expert, and then he would release them back into the wild when he felt he should, you know. And we would get an order for red rat snakes, yellow rat snakes. They were more like a quarter a foot, but a diamondback or a cottonmouth could bring you anywhere from $1.50 to $2 a foot. You know, they were very plentiful, very plentiful. And the trail canal, I'm not exaggerating, was full of banded water snakes, 4.5, sometimes close to 5 foot green water snakes. They were thick cottonmouth moccasins. In the springtime, this time of year, every cypress head you went to, as you walked around it, there'd be little pygmies, you know, ground rattlers coiled up, waiting for prey. They're extremely rare anymore. What happened? It wasn't because a few of us caught snakes and sold them. Something, nobody's ever really done research on the herps. We talk about it.
Right.
And George Dalrymple, who was a scientist, he was a herp. He loved snakes like us. And we had conversations when he was still around periodically about, what do you think happened to snakes? Is it something in the water? Is it prey base? What's happened? Because they're gone. They really are gone. And I encourage Big Cypress numerous times to get somebody who likes snakes and start doing some research on them, but they never have done it. They're not as, well, panthers are much prettier and all that, you know. But that is probably the most significant change has been the snakes.
The snake population,
Yeah.
massive decline.
Yeah.
And you mentioned the trail. That's the US 41 Tamiami Trail.
Yeah, yeah.
And the canal.
Yeah.
There's a lot of gators in it.
Not back then,
but
though.
not
They
back
poached
then.
out. You
Okay.
know, I'm talking 1950s.
Yeah.
You know, and but anywhere you went out, and all those Australian pines that once were along the Tamiami Trail 41, if you wanted rat snakes, you went there and they were in the cavities. You just reached down that cavity and you had
Yellow
one.
rat and corn snakes,
Yeah,
both of them.
yeah. And around the Blue Shanty, that area now where the airboat rides are, that was a prime place for ground rattlers on that old berm from when they built the Tamiami Trail. They're not there anymore. What happened? We don't know.
Yeah.
So
How about the Everglades mink and the river otter?
otters were fairly common. Most of the time we saw them was this time of year when they got hit on the road, on the trail. And the same with minks. At the bottom of the Fakahatchee was the only place I ever saw roadkill minks, you know, in the past. The only minks I ever saw were right here in Fakahatchee. Otters were pretty widespread, and particularly if you wanted to film them or photograph them, this time of year was the time to do it because you'd go in an area that had a pond they'd retreated into and taken up residence, and the young otters would sometimes challenge you, like, this is our mud hole, you leave, you know. They'd come up and bark at you and make little growling noises. And but I don't know, have no knowledge of how plentiful the mink were because we just didn't experience them much. But the corkscrew swamp otters were very plentiful there. And when I worked there in the early 60s, and of course I never had my camera when I would encounter them on the boardwalk, but I remember one time I heard a commotion and there was a log, had some vegetation growing on it in the water, and it was a whole family of otters there. And they each got up. They'd been eating crayfish, you could tell. They each got up on that log and wiggled and defecated and made this funny little noise while they're doing it. And then the next one got up. It was a riot. It was so funny. I'd never seen that before or since, but it was something significant in the family for, you know, let's all have a family, you know. Yeah.
How about bear and bobcat? Were they fairly common?
Yeah, bobcats were pretty common. Bears weren't as common. No. Once in a while, one would break in somebody's camp or something, but they were hunted. There was no regulation on them, you know, and were freely taken, and people shot them, you know. They were vermin, you know, and so they've made an incredible comeback. Now we're trying to deal with the increase in bear population, just like we were trying to deal with the increase in the panther population, you know, with the ranchers and ag people and the homeowners and communities. And so they've both been an increasing success, but now we've got to deal with it. They're not the problem. It's the invasive species, the European white people that came here. They're the problem. And trying to educate them. And you know, some people love them, love to see them, love them to have them around, understand, respect them, but majority of people don't. They think of the black bears in Florida, they're dangerous and they're scary. And same with the panther. It's just a matter of educating people. But they both have made a remarkable comeback from what they were, you know, when they were just hunted. And I have an old Saturday Evening Post article, I think, from the 1920s. Some museum came down here, and they hunted panthers for 2 days with dogs. They killed 7 panthers right there on what is now Collier Boulevard, there near Rattlesnake Hammock in that area.
In the 1920s.
Yeah, they were plentiful then still, even though people shot everyone they saw or tried to, you know, particularly the ranchers.
There must have been a decent amount of deer around at that time.
Yeah, well, that was before the big deer kill and the deer fence, when there again, like the cotton, the cattlemen blamed the white-tailed deer for carrying the, you know, the tick, the fever tick. And so they set out to eradicate all the deer.
That was in the 30s?
Yeah.
And
they built that big deer fence.
What is the deer fence?
It was to my understanding was they would hunt an area and get all the deer, and then you went to the other side of the fence. But there's also the issue that the Seminoles said that we depend on those. We love them. You can't hunt them on our land. Don't you come on our land. But it's typical of a state program. I mean, things haven't changed. They got paid by the ear. The guys that were doing the quartermaster stuff didn't realize deer had 2 ears, I was told. So these guys were double dipping. You know, they'd kill one deer and they'd get paid for 2. But that's probably the only reason. But after that deer killed, then the old game and fish hunters were complaining. There's no deer, no venison. They brought in big bucks from Wisconsin, big massive deer, and released them down here.
In the Big Cypress?
In the Big Cypress, yeah. And they didn't last very long. They had short legs, they were big-bodied, big racks, but they didn't last very long. And they were easy targets. So they really didn't help the deer population. But as we know today, where you see deer, you're going to see panthers. You know, they follow the deer, prey. Yeah.
Okay, and we're still lucky to see raccoons and possums because we don't have that many pythons yet.
Yeah, that's true. South of here in Everglades Park and down there, it's a different story. Yeah.
We take raccoons and possums for granted.
Yeah, we do. Yeah.
Well, we sure appreciate your time again today, Franklin, and all that you've done for your career. And it's been quite a privilege for me to just listen.
Well, thank you, Mike, and Jay, and Becky, and Karen. Thank you.